Hello everyone, for this video will be about shutter speed and how it works and what it is basically and how it works and how and what settings are used to make the shutter speed right for your camera. So I hope you enjoy this presentation. So, what is shutter speed? So in photography is referred as exposure time, implicating the speed which the shutter of the camera closes. So a fast shutter speed creates shorter exposure while a slower one creates a longer exposure. So this applies to the amount of time the light is allowed to be let through the lens. So because I think if you have a faster shutter speed, it means that you have less time for the light to let in. And if you have a slower shutter speed setting, it means that you can give more time for the light to be let through the lens. So it creates I'll get into what it creates. It creates a motion blur effect if you put on a faster shutter speed. Depends what you're doing really. So but it tends to create a freeze frame. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So most modern DSLR cameras are capable of the fastest shutter speed of up to 1/400th of a second. 4,000th of a second. Some go up to 1 in 8,000 of a second. So at the end of the scale of the slowest shutter speeds. So they are measured in whole seconds and generally fall anywhere between around 2 and 30 seconds. So that's basically if you're doing a slower shutter speed or using a longer shutter speed. So basically, as I've already covered the two of them, the ISO and the aperture. But the shutter speed's more to do with how it affects motion, which is inside the triangle, exposure triangle. So if you put on a lighter or faster shutter speed, it means that you create a blur effect because you didn't even you put on a setting where you deliberately want to use the blur effect, motion blur effect, and you can see that it shows that the subject has moved within the frame, and the freeze frame, you can kind of create a blur, but not fully. But you can see a bit of these lines and other things. But it's hard to explain, but I know it creates like a very captivating image when you see images with that kind of framing. So that kind of effect. But I'm gonna get into more as well. So, and here's an image about shutter speed. So the motion it impacts the movement of the subject. So if a person's moving or running or sprinting or whatever they're doing, it captures each motion at a time basically. So this is basically 1 second, but not but it's that under 1 second, which is basically the fastest you can get, really. And it gets, as the number, the lower fraction increases. That's basically a slow shutter speed right there. So it creates this motion blur effect. And the faster shutter speed creates this quick, very vivid image. And you can see it doesn't have the blur on it. So you're allowing more light to be let in. Well, it goes up, the more light you let in, the more. Cause if it's faster, you're letting more in, and then if you're doing it slowly, it's less. So these are just comparisons. The first image there is comparison with a 1/5 second shutter speed, and the other one's 6 seconds. So the 6 second one, it kind of creates a blur effect, and the other one doesn't. So it looks like a normal image basically. And you see fast and shutter speeds. And the 1/48 second is ideal for 24 frames per second, which is basically the 24 frames per second is mainly the standard European amount of framing. And some Hollywood films, so it use 25, which is kind of close to it because it's the same basically. Because one of my films, I think I used 25 when I was supposed to use 24, but it doesn't really matter because they're both very similar. If you use 30, which is basically more better, I think the images will be more better if it's 30. And that's often commonly seen in a lot of high end TV shows and stuff. They tend to use that 30 seconds frames per second as their base, but it's in America. I think it applies with TV serials in America, and the images come out really good apparently. So as I have touched on this, maybe I did it wrong way round, but that more light is needed for the faster shutter speed, and the less light is for the for slower shutter speeds. So you can see that it contrasts darker images. So the faster the shutter speed, the more light needed. The darker the image produces darker images with less motion blur, and the opposite is the slowest shutter speed, less light needed, and producing more light, brighter images with more motion blur. That's basically what you. This one is easier to remember, so hopefully that will sink in. So what does shutter speed affect the motion, the the look of an image? What does it do to an image, basically? So in previous examples of images, so as you've seen, images with shutter speed setting are captured with motion blur and freeze effect movement and to freeze movement. So most examples of shutter speed include images of wildlife and other nature photography. So you tend to see a lot of nature images produced in that nature. Like they say wildlife when you see a cheetah or a jaguar, a cheetah running for its prey or whatever. I don't know if that's the best example to use. you might have to use a slower shutter speed, so you can, a faster one to capture the movement without the motion blur. I think it's more better for nature to have less blur, so you can see the details and the colors. You can see the resolution of the image. It makes the image have more quality to it as well. So to use it effectively when you are out shooting different settings with various subjects, you need to understand the difference between fast and slow shutter speed and the best techniques to achieve your desired results. So you can't just go about film, taking pictures for the sake of it. You need to understand what shutter speed will be useful for that sort of thing. Well, you could easily go on the editing software if you can't get the desired one that you want. But you can achieve it, but you want more from it. If you want more, let's say if you want more from it, and that's not the camera settings are not giving you, but it depends on the make that you're using. You can use editing software like Adobe Lightroom, which is basically what you use for photographs to make them more the way you want them to look. And you can alter the settings to manipulate the photo settings to make it more standard or professional to the desired result that you wanted the image to look. Now, I've used Adobe Lightroom. I've never used it until like last year because I did a photography workshop. I was part of a photography workshop, and this woman, she showed us how to use the program, and it was really amazing. And I learned from a lot from doing all the learning from the software. I never really known about Adobe Lightroom. I knew about Photoshop where you can manipulate the photo, but Lightroom is in next level stuff, basically. That's all I could tell you. And look at this. This is incredible. So that's what you get. Look how the motion blur. That motion blur looks so clean. Like there's barely anything gone wrong. I think they had to alter something to make it look like that. I'm not sure what it is, but they did something. I think maybe they altered the focus and the shutter speed and the exposure. I think they used a slow shutter speed, but with a longer exposure time. I think that because you can create a motion blur, but that looks like that. I think that's the only way you can achieve that. And that has a motion blur as well, but they did something completely different to that. So they basically used. I'll get to. I think they allowed the use of the aperture or something. Depth of field. They made the depth of field more shallow, so make you could make use of the motions of what is happening in this photo. It's quite busy, so and the squirrel maybe they freeze. It's like a freeze movement, and the ladies. It's quite extraordinary. These photos. People wonder how they do it, and I just to mention that that's how they do it. They used the settings that were implemented, that were there in the camera, that you could make use of. So because if you don't, I think they because of exposure time, you need to learn and understand how you're going to achieve these results and how and when to use it. So you could get the right image and the right impact and the right timing. I think it's about timing. Shutter speeds are all about timing because if you're focused on motion, you need to anticipate timing as well because you're taking a photo and you want the image to look exactly. This one, you need a specific one because you can't just take photos and you don't get the image. And if she's not doing that, then there's not much else you could really do. That's the only way you're going to achieve it. You can't just make her do it, then fake it. It's not. I think these images, you can't really fake it. So, how does shutter speed affect the depth of field? So, basically, it has some impacts of it. So, when changing it, the aperture size, you have to shift the shutter speed on one side to maintain a consistent exposure rate and making sure this aperture change is there and therefore it alters the depth of field accordingly. So I have gone through, but I haven't really touched. I will touch on that in the nut. It's kind of a series, but not really. So that shallow depth of field is basically when the background is blurry, is out of focus or blurry, let's say. But some people use that word blurry, but we say out of focus. And a deep depth of field is when it is in focus. Everything is in balance, basically. So the background will be more in balance. But I will do a video on that anyway, so yeah. And you can see the f stops, what it's measured at. Because remember I said the aperture is to do with I always forget, but the aperture is more to do with the amount of light you let in, the size of the light, the lens when you are taking a photo and you letting in light. That's what it's to do with. So how does it affect the ISO? So shooting in low light situations does require the ISO to be increased. So maybe it should start at 4. Let's say it's just supposed to start at 400 or above. So it might also be necessary to use a higher ISO setting when shooting with a narrow aperture or a higher shutter speed, since they both reduce the amount of light that strikes the image sensor. So it affects the ISO to make it so you can see the image more clearly, basically. I think that's what this is the point it's trying to make here. So basically the shutter speed is less light that's let in if you have a higher one. Then if you have a slow one you have more of a chance to get more light in. And it makes the image more, because sometimes some people don't really know how to make a mistake. I've made mistakes with cameras as well. It's not just I'm just speaking from experience. I have made a few mistakes. So there's times where I've used the shutter speed and I accidentally overexpose the image. So it can happen when you overexpose because you can create this washed out effect and you don't want to have a washed out effect. And that goes with photography as well. And same because you can get a less washed out effect This underexposed is more darker and we have more shadows and very harsh. I think very lots of shadows in the photo. And how does it affect exposure? Exposure, I mean to say. So all you need to remember is the faster the shutter speed, the shorter time the image sensor is exposed to light. So the slower it is, the longer time of the image has sensor is exposed to light. So you see the difference clearly with this image. Because the faster shutter speed is a very fast. You can see that it didn't even allow the image to be exposed. The lights, there's less light. They just didn't allow. They just made it so fast that's what you only see the motion of the image, just motion, the impact of the motion of it, not the actual colors and stuff. You just see how it looks like when it's moving at a certain rate. And slow shutter speeds allow more light, so you can see the colors, the whole thing, quite frankly, of this image because it's very light, has a very light orientated feel to it. So choosing the right shutter speed. So most cameras have automatic settings to shutter speed for everything, including shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So it's already done for you the settings, but you can manually do it yourself without needing it to your own desired settings, what you prefer and what is right, what you think will look good, or what you like the image to have good quality and you know. So it helps beginners to come to grip with different shutter speeds without feeling intimidated. So you can try and experiment with it as well. Because you don't have to always feel restricted. You don't need to worry too much about it. Because photography can, and some people find it intimidating to use it because they don't feel they can go for it. But I think you should try because you're only gonna improve if you try. Try it out, have a go, and see what kind of results you get from it. You're just playing around with it. You don't need to worry about being restricted. So even professional photographers use the setting for ease when shooting in an environment where the light changes quickly. So you need to be on your game if you're going outside or stuff when you're shooting or taking when you're shooting because the light every hour, the sun always goes changes its axis or what you call it, the radius or something. Each time, I think because the Earth orbits the sun. I'm not good at science. I think the sun orbits the Earth. I think I can't remember. I'm not very good at science, so and you need to be careful when the sun comes out at a certain time, then it turns to night. Like the moon comes out, but the moon won't give you enough light, obviously, because you're gonna be relying on LED lights and artificial lights instead of natural lights. Because natural light is very difficult to control most times because each time it changes. So 1 minute it's cloudy and the other minute is not. Because the weather can impact how the image looks as well. Because if you have a one image that's very cloudy and never, you want it to be consistent basically. Just be aware that you need to have a consistency to it, because things can change quite quickly when you're outside and you're working on some a project where you have to shoot in natural daylight. Or filmmaking is the same, because continuity is very essential for filmmakers to make sure they have the, consistent basis of what they want to do. And these are the shutter speed settings that you could go for, when and where, and how what it could be used for. So let's say one over 1/2000th of a second is for freezing birds in a flight. So basically, you can use that setting for it, and it goes on and on if you want to read. Shutter priority mode allows you to set and adjust shutter speed in photography. So you're likely to shoot in the shutter priority mode in nature photography when you can freeze a fast moving animal on the ground or sky. Sorry about this image. If you are epileptic or anything, don't. It's best if you don't look at this image, because it's quite. If you're photosensitive to it, because it's very rapid. I shall warn you about it. I'll warn you you should look in the description. I'll warn you in there. Some images may contain. If you have photosensitive epilepsy, I think you should be mindful of what images you look at in this video. So, shutter priority allows you to set and adjust. So it creates this very, you can see all it's motion blur, but you only see the detail of the car, but not fully. And it's like you're in a race, and this person has decided to do it to make it look like fast, they're in a race, or the car's driving really quickly. So the difference between slower and longer shutter speeds. Fast shutter speeds are at 1/500th of a second or faster. Will freeze or capture quick moving action, so you can get a clear image of subjects that will otherwise be blurred. So basically, that's an example of a tennis ball moving at a certain rate. You want to make sure you capture the tennis ball while it's airborne to where it is, to the height it's thrown up, and you can see all the water droplets coming from it. So it's good that you sense the movement of the tennis ball. So slow shutter speeds often refer to a larger fraction of a second, such as half or quarter. Slow shutter speeds can capture movement and introduce blur, usually for slower moving subjects. So basically, this image creates this slow shutter speed, but only certain aspects of it is changed. So you can see the motion blur, and you don't see what it is that's blurry. You can't, because the movement has already happened, and you can actually achieve this through editing. You, that's what I would say. And long shutter speeds are typically are typically around 1 second or longer. So it's like slow shutter speeds. They are used for blurring, adding blurring effects to images. They cause the blurring effect, and you want to be able to anticipate when you are doing it. I think it gives more exposure time, similar to the fast shutter speed. The slower one, slow shutter speed. To apologise. It's a bit similar to the second one in a way. And here are the references. So I hope you enjoyed this video and gained some kind of knowledge from what shutter speed could be, and you may have some kind of idea on what it is and what it entails and when to use it, and you will feel confident once you get the hang of it if you experiment more or play with the settings more. So I hope I'll see you in the next video. Bye.